Not all pacifists were like Oppenheimer. Others wanted to nuke the USSR into oblivion, killing hundreds of millions of people and wipe it off the map. But what would drive well-known pacifists into advocating for such barbarity? Let me explain. Well, there are two main groups of intellectual pacifists who emerged after World War II. The first kind is what I call the rainbows and unicorns type, the people who believe that nuclear weapons would force humanity by necessity to becoming better, to finally grow beyond our squabbling, power-hungry, hunter-gatherer mindset and enter a new age of enlightenment. In Oppenheimer's 1946 commencement address, hoping for humanity to now evolve into a new, more high-minded species, Homo sapiens 2.0 perhaps, he says atomic weapons has led us up those last few steps to the mountain pass, and beyond there is a different country. Fellow physicist Arthur Compton was also in this group. In light of the potential death and destruction of a civilization that had been growing for 1,000 years, he says, a new level of human understanding is needed. We are forced to grow into a greater manhood. Albert Einstein was also thinking along the same lines. The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything except our thinking. Thus we are drifting towards a catastrophe beyond conception. We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if mankind is to survive. The problem is, even with the threat of our almost guaranteed destruction, is that really enough of a reason to expect man to suddenly change its behavior? If there's one thing that's been a constant throughout all of human existence since time immemorial, it's our insatiable desire for conflict, war and destruction. It's in our very nature, ingrained in not only our own DNA but also perhaps the DNA of all animals going back billions of years. We might need to change for our own survival, but is it reasonable to assume that we will or can even change? The famous von Neumann, co-creator of the atomic bomb, in the 1950 edition of Life magazine, in a conversation about preemptive nuclear strikes against the USSR, he reportedly said, "If you say, why not bomb them tomorrow? I say, why not today? If you say, today at 5 o'clock, I say, why not 1 o'clock? This might sound horrific to our modern sensibilities, but he was hardly alone. We need to remember what these people had lived through. They grew up hearing about the destruction of Europe brought by the Napoleonic Wars, the notion that it must never happen again, and that now the more enlightened Europe, with all its treaties to balance power among the previously squabbling states, will ensure this. Despite those hearty attempts, World War I still happens, and it's infinitely more destructive than the last war. Never can this ever happen again." And thus, once again, all the biggest and brightest brains of the age, led by the rainbows and unicorns thinker Woodrow Wilson, created the League of Nations and appeasement to avoid another war. And guess what? World War II happened, and it was infinitely more destructive than the last. And now, if you look at the late 40s, early 50s, the rate of change is mind-blowing. Geopolitical thunderstorms are happening literally every 5 seconds. The victorious allies are falling out. The USSR is consolidating its power throughout Eastern Europe, and oh my god, the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb decades before anyone expected them to, and oh my lord, China has just fallen to communism. The UK gets its first bomb, and what are we doing about it? Surely we can't use appeasement again, because Stalin is looking more like Adolf after every passing day. World War III against the USSR seems imminent, and at the same time Western Europe is pretty much bankrupt and has almost completely demobilized. The Soviet army could seemingly just sweep across Europe and reach the Atlantic Ocean with almost no effort, and at the same time Truman also has to slash the US's military budget by 70%. And then in 1952, the hydrogen bomb, the thermonuclear bomb, hundreds of times more devastating than the atomic bomb, was invented. In this environment, how can a pragmatist not snort at Oppenheimer's rainbows and unicorns idea of humanity suddenly changing its ways and deciding to come together, putting aside their differences and becoming peaceful for the betterment betterment of all? Are these numpties even living in the real world? Many Western generals and politicians were thinking the exact same thing. Even the most renowned pacifist of his age was Bertrand Russell, who was famous for serving jail time for opposing World War I. In his essay, The Betterment of Man, he proposes 3 possible outcomes for the future of humanity. And guess what? They're all terrifying. The first is the end of human life and perhaps of all life on the planet. The second scenario is a reversion to barbarism after a catastrophe, diminution of the population of the globe. This is what he proposes as the best case scenario if no action is taken. He says, if things are allowed to drift, it is obvious that the bickering between Russia and the Western democracies will continue until Russia has a considerable store of atomic bombs, and that when that time comes, there will be an atomic war. In such a war, even if the worst consequences are avoided, Western Europe, including Great Britain, will be virtually exterminated. Yikes. And remember, that is the best case scenario if no action is taken. And the third scenario is a unification of the world under a single government possessing a monopoly of the major weapons of war. And the third one is the one that he proposes is the best course of action. And the terrifying thing is, he says the only way to achieve a peaceful global empire where the people become gradually more good-natured and less inclined to persecute like the Romans, they will in the course of time extend citizenship to the vanquished. There will then be a true world state, and it will be possible to forget that it would have owed its origin to conquest. The only way to achieve this is by nuking and completely and utterly eliminating the USSR. And to make this even more frightful, there's a ticking clock, and it's 1 minute till midnight, for it's only during the few years in the early 50s perhaps that the US had an almost a complete monopoly on atomic weapons, and enough of them to take out the USSR. The longer they wait, the more nukes the Russians would get, which would lead to an inevitable destruction of everyone. I can't express the unfathomable theoretical power the US had over the rest of the world during this time. It's almost unprecedented. History podcaster Dan Carlin called it a royal flush. It's a once-in-a-millennia opportunity to not only eliminate your geopolitical opposition, but to also save humanity from almost complete and certain doom. It would have been the logical and pragmatic thing to do. And ladies and gentlemen, this is how a group of pacifists ended up advocating for the complete nuclear destruction and genocide of hundreds of millions of people in the USSR. Would you have been on Oppenheimer's or Bertrand Russell's side? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.